On March 4th, 2026, a woman pulled her 2016 Highlander into my shop holding a printed dealership quote like it was a diagnosis she did not want to accept. She was not there for a repair. She was there for maintenance. Routine, scheduled, nothing is wrong maintenance. Her Highlander had just crossed 118,000 miles, and the dealership told her it was time for new spark plugs. She expected a bill somewhere around $200. That is what her last car cost her for the same job. Instead, the quote in her hand read $947 for spark plugs. Not a timing belt, not a transmission, not a single broken part. 6 spark plugs and the labor to install them. Today, I am revealing why one of the most basic maintenance jobs in the entire automotive world becomes a 4-figure invoice the moment it happens on a Toyota V6, and why almost nobody sees it coming until the day it lands on their own dashboard. This is not a scam. This is not a dealership padding numbers because they think you will not notice. This is something far more interesting. A genuine engineering trade-off buried inside one of the most reliable engines Toyota has ever built. One that quietly punishes owners the moment the odometer crosses 6 figures. Here is what almost nobody tells you when they hand you the keys to a Camry, a Highlander, a Sienna, an Avalon, a Tacoma, a 4Runner, or even a Lexus ES350 or RX 350. Every one of those vehicles has, at some point, shared the same basic V6 architecture, the 3.5-liter 2GRFE and its close relatives. It is one of the most trusted engines Toyota has ever produced. It regularly runs past 250,000 miles with nothing more than oil changes and basic upkeep. Mechanics respect this engine, owners love this engine, and almost none of them understand what happens the first time it needs new spark plugs. The woman in my shop was not being scammed. Her dealership was not lying to her. The invoice she was holding was, unfortunately, close to accurate. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why, what your own risk looks like if you own one of these vehicles, and more importantly, what you can do to keep that bill from becoming a $2,000 nightmare instead of a $900 inconvenience. Let's start with the part almost every owner gets wrong. They assume spark plugs are spark plugs, small, cheap, universal parts that any shop can swap out in 20 minutes for the cost of a tank of gas. And on most 4-cylinder engines, that assumption holds up fine. Pop the hood, pull the coil packs, unscrew 6 plugs, drop in new ones, done. 30 minutes, maybe less. That is the job most people picture in their head when a service advisor says the words spark plugs. It is also the job that almost never happens on this engine. The 2GRFE is a V6, and it is mounted transversely, meaning sideways, across the engine bay. That single design choice is the root of everything that follows. In a longitudinal engine, the kind you find in a rear-wheel drive truck or an older Crown Victoria, both banks of cylinders sit out in the open, facing the sides of the engine bay where a mechanic can reach them without much drama. But in a transverse V6, crammed sideways into a front-wheel drive platform to save space, one entire bank of cylinders gets pushed backward, hard against the firewall, buried underneath the intake manifold, wedged into the tightest, least accessible corner of the entire engine compartment. 3 of your 6 spark plugs sit right up front, easy to reach, exactly the kind of job most people imagine. The other 3, the rear bank, sit almost against the cabin wall, hidden underneath a plastic intake plenum that has to come off before a technician can even see the plugs, let alone touch them. This is not a defect. It is not an oversight. Every automaker that builds transverse V6 engines runs into the exact same geometry problem, because physics does not leave room to negotiate. But Toyota's version of this layout, shared across millions of Camrys, Highlanders, Siennas, Avalons, RAV4s, Tacomas, and 4Runners built over nearly 2 decades, means this specific packaging compromise has quietly affected more American driveways than almost any other single design decision in the company's modern lineup. So what actually has to happen to reach those 3 rear plugs? This is where the invoice starts making sense. First, the intake air ducting, and, on many of these models, the wiper cowl and wiper motor housing have to be removed just to clear working space at the base of the windshield. Then the upper intake manifold, the large plastic assembly that channels air into all 6 cylinders, has to be unbolted and lifted completely out of the engine bay. That means disconnecting the throttle body, unplugging sensor harnesses, removing brackets, and in many model years, loosening or repositioning coolant lines that route directly across the top of the manifold. Only after all of that is out of the way do the rear coil packs and spark plugs actually become visible. Compare that to the front bank. Pop a plastic engine cover, unclip the coils, and the plugs are sitting right there in the open. 30 to 45 minutes for the front 3. 2, sometimes 3 additional hours for the rear 3, once you account for careful reassembly, torque specifications on intake bolts, and making sure no vacuum leaks get introduced in the process. A shop rated this exact job at 4 out of 5 on the difficulty scale, with an average completion time of roughly 3.5 hours for someone doing it correctly. Multiply that by a dealership labor rate of $150 to $200 an hour, and you already understand where $900 comes from before a single spark plug has even been priced. And here is the detail that makes people the angriest once they understand it. The parts themselves are not expensive. A full set of 6 OEM spec iridium spark plugs for this engine typically runs somewhere between $60 and $110 total. That is not a typo. Roughly 10% of that $900 invoice is the actual part being installed. The other 90% is entirely labor, entirely the cost of disassembling and reassembling half the top of the engine just to reach 3 pieces of metal that, on paper, weigh a few ounces combined. This is why online forums are full of Toyota owners comparing wildly different quotes for what should be an identical job. One independent shop quotes $415. A different dealership quotes $1,013. Both numbers can be legitimate because both shops are pricing the same 3.5 hours of labor at completely different hourly rates, and some shops build in extra time for coolant system bleeding, gasket replacement, or intake resealing that others skip. The spread is not evidence of fraud. It is evidence of just how much labor time this single job demands compared to almost any other spark plug replacement on the road. Now here is where it gets genuinely dangerous, not just expensive, and this is the part most owners never hear until it is too late. Toyota specifies long-life iridium spark plugs in this engine, rated to go 100,000 miles, sometimes stretched to 120,000 miles in the maintenance schedule. That sounds like a benefit, and in most ways it is. Fewer trips to the shop, fewer chances for a technician to strip a thread or cross a bolt. But it also means most owners go a decade or more without ever thinking about their spark plugs at all. The job is invisible for so long that people forget it exists as a maintenance item, right up until a check engine light, a misfire, or a scheduled service reminder puts it back in front of them all at once. That long gap is exactly what turns a merely expensive job into a potentially catastrophic one. Spark plugs thread directly into an aluminum cylinder head. Across more than 100,000 miles of heat cycling, that aluminum expands and contracts around the plug's steel threads thousands of times. If a plug was not properly torqued or anti-seized at the factory, or if moisture and corrosion have worked their way into those threads over a decade of driving, the plug can seize in place. When a technician tries to back it out, instead of turning smoothly, the plug shears off, leaving the broken end and sometimes the electrode fused into the cylinder head itself. When that happens on the easy front bank, it is an annoying delay. When it happens on the buried rear bank, where the intake manifold is already removed and access is already at its absolute limit, a broken plug can mean pulling the cylinder head entirely to extract it safely. I have seen that exact scenario turn a $900 maintenance job into a $2,500 repair in a single afternoon. And I have watched the color drain from an owner's face when they hear the word cylinder head attached to something they walked in calling routine maintenance. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every one of these invoices. The danger is not that the job is hard. Technicians who specialize in these engines do it correctly every day without incident. The danger is that most owners have no idea the risk window even exists because the interval is so long that spark plugs quietly slide off their radar entirely, right up until the exact moment they carry the highest chance of something going wrong. So what do you actually do with all of this? First, know your engine. If you own a Camry, Highlander, Sienna, Avalon, RAV4, Tacoma, or 4Runner built with the 3.5-liter V6 or a Lexus ES350 or RX350 sharing that same architecture, this job is coming for you eventually, and pretending it will be a quick $150 stop is only setting yourself up for sticker shock. Look up your specific mileage against your owner's manual. Most schedules call for inspection or replacement somewhere in the 100,000 to 120,000 mile range. Do not let that number quietly pass you by the way most owners do. Second, get more than one quote before you commit. Because this job is almost entirely labor, the price swings dramatically between shops, and a dealership charging $150 to $200 an hour is going to land in a very different place than an independent shop specializing in Toyota 5.6 engines, charging $100 to $130 an hour for the exact same 3.5 hours of work. A $1,000 quote does not automatically mean you are being overcharged, but it absolutely means it is worth calling 2 or 3 other shops before you sign off. Third, if you are even moderately comfortable with a socket set and a service manual, this is a job many confident do-it-yourselfers take on themselves specifically because labor is the entire cost driver. Removing the intake manifold on this engine is well documented, with detailed guides and forum threads walking through every bolt, every hose, and every torque specification. Doing it yourself will not save you on parts, because parts were never the expensive part to begin with, but it can turn a $900 bill into roughly $80 in plugs and an afternoon of careful, methodical work. Fourth, and this matters more than people expect, do not let this maintenance stretch far past its recommended interval, hoping to avoid the bill. Every extra year those plugs sit untouched in an aluminum head is another year of heat cycling working against you, another year pushing you closer to that seized thread scenario that turns an expensive job into a genuinely serious one. The single best way to keep this repair between $500 and $900 instead of above $2,000 is simply not letting it become overdue. And finally, if a shop is already reaching deep into your engine bay for another reason, a timing chain cover gasket, a water pump, valve cover reseal, ask whether the spark plugs are close enough to their interval to handle at the same time. Because so much of this job's cost comes from simply gaining access to the rear bank. Bundling it with other work that already requires removing the same intake components can meaningfully cut down the total labor hours you are paying for twice. The Toyota 5.6 sitting under the hood of your Camry, Highlander, Sienna, or 4Runner is one of the most dependable engines on the road today, and nothing about this changes that. But dependability was never free. It came with a packaging trade-off buried 3 layers deep under your intake manifold, one that most owners never learn about until a service advisor hands them a number that does not match anything they were expecting. Now you know exactly why that number exists, exactly what drives it, and exactly what you can do to make sure it never catches you off guard the way it caught the woman standing in my shop holding that quote for $947. If this explained a bill you have been staring at, or one you know is coming, hit like, so more Toyota and Lexus owners see this before their own quote lands. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns that turn confusing invoices into things you actually understand. And if you have ever gotten a spark plug quote that made you do a double take, drop the number in the comments. You would be surprised how many other owners are sitting on the exact same surprise, just waiting for their odometer to catch up.